Good morning. Can you all hear me out there? All right, perfect. We're gonna get started shortly. Just gonna allow a couple more minutes, a couple more seconds for people to get in, and then we'll be getting started, all right? All right, good morning. All right, how is everybody today? Good, good, good. Well, I hope you guys are ready to hear an amazing speaker this morning. Her name is Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, and she's going to talk to us about the Underground Railroad and the waterways and the slave trade here in Virginia. We're going to have, just tell you the order of events, we're going to have her speak to us today, and then we're going to save all our questions until afterwards because we're going to kind of have a roundtable discussion in a sense where we're going to allow you to ask any questions that you may have, share any stories that you may have, and then we'll just make sure. We're going to have a brief little recess in between then, so we'll have some refreshments and everything, but overall we want everyone to have a great time today and share what you know, learn a little bit more that you may not have known, and then we ask that you go out and share this with everyone else afterwards, all right? All right, so we'll get started. My name is Ebony Pope, and I am the Elder of Innovation and Tech here at Second Calvary Baptist Church. Reverend Jeffrey V. Guns, of course, is our senior pastor. I am assisted today by Sister Toby Word. She kind of helped facilitate everything, so you'll be hearing from the two of us. So before we really get started, I'm going to invite Reverend Guns to come up and pray with us this morning, all right?
Thank you, Elder Pope. Good morning, everyone. God bless you, and I just want to say thank you to Dr. Alexander for being here today. Let us pray. God of grace and mercy, we are thankful for the opportunity that brings us together. And oh God, as we come to engage, to listen, to learn, to share, to be informed, to be inspired, to be encouraged, we ask your blessings upon our presenter today. We thank you that she took the time to come to share with us. And we thank you for those who are a part of the larger audience who is viewing online. We ask your blessings upon this gathering this morning. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
All right, so we're going to get started. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Sister Toby Word up so she can introduce our guest speaker. So if you all could please give her a round of applause. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I also would like to just extend my thanks for your presence here this morning. We are very excited about this program, and as Pastor Gunn said, we so appreciate Dr. Newby Alexander making time to join us here today. So I have the honor of introducing our speaker for this morning. Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander is the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture, Emeritus Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the Study of the African Diaspora, and former Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University. Behold. She is the author Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, published in 2017, An African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, published in 2010. Dr. Newby Alexander co-authored Black America series, Portsmouth, in 2003. Also co-authored Hampton Roads, Remembering Our Schools in 2009, and co-edited Voices from Within the Veil, African Americans and the Experience of Democracy in 2008. Dr. Newby Alexander has appeared on a number of national programs and documentaries, including PBS's Many Rivers to Cross, the History Channel's Race, Slavery, and the Civil War, and C-SPAN's broadcasts on history. So I ask you to please join me in welcoming to the stage this morning Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander.
Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you all coming out on a Saturday morning to hear history. That really makes my heart sing, because I believe that one of the most important things that we do is not to forget our past. And especially in light of so many lies, it's constant lies that hit us every single day about our past. People are either ashamed of our past, don't want to talk about our past, or lie about our past. And so this story that I'm going to tell you, and I really consider it a story about the Underground Railroad. It's a true story, but it is so important that we understand it. Norfolk was considered by one of the most famous station masters on the Underground Railroad. In fact, he was called the father of the Underground Railroad, William Still. Norfolk was considered the Southern Depot. That meant that more people left from Norfolk than any place else, that there was just this concentration. And while William Still only documents a fraction in his book, he lets you know there were a lot more people who escaped than what he was talking about. But I want to start my discussion, aside from telling you that, and then later on telling you why so many people left from Norfolk. I want to start with a story that began in Pennsylvania. So let's look at the next slide. This sign, this historic sign, is outside of the office that used to belong to a man who was the station master of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, 244 South 12th Street. It was a busy place, especially in the 1840s and 50s. In August of 1850, a 50-year-old man walked into the office. His name was Peter Friedman. Somehow, Peter had made this arduous journey from Alabama to Pennsylvania. If you can imagine, Alabama to Pennsylvania in 1850. Now, even though he had purchased his freedom, which is why he called himself Freedman, he was still a black man in America. And that meant that as a free black, his rights were infringed upon. And at any point in time, he could be kidnapped and sold into slavery, or simply arrested on trumped-up charges and sold into slavery, or simply been accused of being a fugitive slave and then put into slavery, unless he had free papers. But of course, free papers could be stolen from you. They could be burned. And what proof did you have? As a black person, you could not testify in America against a white person. You could not. It was illegal for you to do so. So you could not even have a basic right of self-defense. So Peter Friedman walks into this office, and he's brought there by a man that he had met once he entered Philadelphia, and he was telling them, He was looking for his parents. He had been separated from his parents 40 years prior to that. And he wanted to find his parents, and he had heard that maybe in Philadelphia he could find them. And so when he entered the office, he met a man who was 29 years old. His name was William Still. William Still was this young man eagerly greeting him, and he had been serving for quite a while as the secretary of the Pennsylvania the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. So when he walked in to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society office, it was William Still who was always there. And so, next slide. So William Still listened to his story, but Peter Friedman was very suspicious. As you can see with that sign, the slave hunter is among us. That was the tremendous fear all the time, that slave hunters were always looking for people. You were incentivized to be a slave hunter in America, especially in this period from 1800 to 1860. Why? Because here in Norfolk and in all of Hampton Roads, people were selling their slaves to the lower South, starting in the 1830s in huge numbers. Why? Because in the 1840s, if you owned someone, a young man, a young woman who had proven, especially if the woman had proven herself to be a breeder, to be able to produce children in large numbers, you could get up to $1,500 for that individual. Now let me give you an idea of what we're talking about. In the 1840s, $1,500 is comparable to about $65,000 in our dollars. You all understand? And unlike our inflation rate, you could live like a king or queen if you had $65,000 in your bank. And so the idea of kidnapping somebody and then you selling them into slavery, you could benefit a lot from that. In addition, you had slaveholders who were offering $50 to $100 to $200 reward for a person. Now imagine if you could offer that much money as a reward for the return of a person who escaped from you. How much money were you getting with their labor in their lifetime? On average, it was well over $1 million in our dollars. So I hope you understand this was big business. The lie that was perpetrated in our society for a long time was that at the end of slavery, everybody who was a slaveholder lost everything. That's about as big of a lie as you can throw out there. That was not at all true. And so this notion that that somebody who's free will walk into a building, into a room, and they don't know the people. That idea that I might get kidnapped was very much at the forefront of most free blacks' minds, and especially Peter Friedman. So he sat down with William Still and he started to tell his story. He talked about how his older brother, Levin, had died 19 years prior to that. And then he talked about other details of his family. And William Still kept asking more and more and more questions. Finally, he asked the man who was accompanying Peter, could you just step outside the office? I need to talk to him privately. And the man said, okay. And he sat down next to him. And he said, you are my long-lost brother. 40 years ago, when my parents escaped, My mother was captured and returned back to the South, she and her children. And when she made a second attempt, before she made a second attempt, her punishment was that they sold 2 of her oldest children away from her. And for 40 years, she has mourned the loss of her 2 children. And I'm here to tell you, I'm going to take you to see our mother. And he did. They went across the Delaware River, and there he had an opportunity for his mother, for their mother, who had been distraught for 40 years, to see her children. And when she looked at them, she had tears running down her face. And she said, "How long have I prayed to see my 2 sons?" And you can imagine, let's have the next slide, please. This was Peter, and this was their mother, Charity. You can imagine the faith that was required to hold on to the belief, to the prayer that one day she would see her children. Now, she did not see in life one of the 2 sons, but she did see this one, Peter. And of course, when you look at a picture, which you will in a minute, of William Still, you can see the family resemblance. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of William Still. And I'm surprised that Peter didn't notice the similarities when he saw his brother. But he had a chance to then not only get to know the Still family, but Peter had a wife who was still in slavery, and children. And so William Still worked with his network to not only get his wife but his children out of slavery. And they settled in a place in New Jersey, of all places, and I'll tell you why New Jersey is such a bizarre place. But in New Jersey, where they settled, and that's where Peter continued to live the rest of his life with William Still's other siblings. Now, the reason that New Jersey is so bizarre is because it had these pockets of abolitionism throughout the state. It even had an area that intentionally settled a lot of freedom seekers, people who had escaped from slavery and were desirous of being free. At the same time, New Jersey was the last northern state, with the exception of Delaware, that got rid of slavery. So even in this time period, New Jersey was a supporter of slavery, while at the same time having these pockets of communities of formerly enslaved people or freedom seekers. William Still, I'll go back for just a second to the previous slide. Thank you. So William Still, after meeting, encountering his brother, he later said that was a defining moment for him. He knew that his work, if he recorded his work, could potentially be that thing to help future families reunite. And so he committed to work night and day to record every story of every person who walked through his doors, so that they and their stories would not only not be forgotten, but that their families could eventually, perhaps, find them if they also made it to freedom. William Still was an incredible pack rat. You know, historians love pack rats. Not junk pack rats, but pack rats, people who keep documents. And we especially love their children who recognize that their parents' documents are priceless. There's some children who throw the documents away because in their minds it's worthless. But William Still's son did not do that. William Still had boxes and boxes and boxes of documents. So precious were these accounts to William Still that in 1862, when you had the Battle of Gettysburg, when there was tremendous fear that perhaps the Confederacy would overrun the Union lines, William Still took all of his records and buried them in a cemetery and constantly checked to make sure that those records had not been disturbed. He did this for the rest of the Civil War, and then afterwards retrieved those records, eventually put them all together and published them in a book in 1872 called The Underground Railroad, where he talked about 763 people who had passed through his station, including a woman by the name of Minty Ross, who renamed herself, when she got to the north, Harriet Tubman. Next slide, please. And so, if you look at his book, you will see that the largest number of people came from Maryland, of course, because Maryland was right next to Philadelphia, or I should say Pennsylvania. It was just across the water. Most of those people, and I want to kind of dissuade you about these myths about what you might think about the Underground Railroad. Like, there was no such thing as people making quilts and hanging them out to tell people about the Underground Railroad. That was nonsense. That was created by a woman who wrote a children's book. It became so popular that she perpetrated a fraud and made it seem as if she had found all these documents showing that there were quilts that people would hang out outside to tell people where to go and blah, blah, blah. In fact, I was at a conference with a group of historians who focus on the Underground Railroad, and I asked them, what is this stuff about the quilts? I've never seen any information about that. And that's when I heard the story of what this woman had done. It was such a big fraud that the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress actually had an exhibit on it. If you can imagine, of all the people, you would think they would first check out to see if this is true before they let the world know. They didn't do that. And so I still encounter people who love to tell me about all these quilts. I'm just like, no, that's a lie. Anyway, William Still's stories are not lies, because I found so many of the people in the records, and I've found out what happened to some of the people. And of course, some of these individuals also wrote their own stories, like Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself to the North, and then he wrote his own accounts. And we have a lot of people in this area who've actually written accounts about their experiences, and I'll talk about a few of them in just a short while. The second largest group who escaped came from Virginia. That should not surprise you at all. In the antebellum period, again from 1800 to 1860, Virginia had not only the largest number of people in the nation, by the way. It wasn't until after the Civil War that Massachusetts began to have a larger population than Virginia. But Virginia also had the largest number of African Americans of any place in the nation. And so the myth that we have today that Virginia was predominantly white is not true. Virginia had black people everywhere in the state, including West Virginia, which, by the way, is where Booker T. Washington's family moved. So when he went to Hampton, he came from West Virginia to Hampton. And a lot of people, because of our failure to really tell history, they don't know this information. But here in Virginia, Virginia had the largest number of free blacks in any state in the nation until the mid-1840s, and then it was beat out only slightly by Maryland. And the reason Virginia's free black population reduced was because of the laws that harmed free blacks in Virginia, and they were moving in large numbers to not only Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey, but especially to Massachusetts, while some of them actually moved to Liberia or to Sierra Leone. And so, and there are all kinds of reasons why they actually left the country, and it had to do with things such as the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that incentivized people to find, judges or magistrates to find that you are indeed a fugitive slave. They would pay them more if they declared you were a fugitive slave versus not being a fugitive slave. And that's why northern states like Massachusetts passed a law refusing to adhere to that federal law. So this whole idea that states would pass laws saying, I'm not going to adhere to a federal law, is not unusual. We have this idea that all states have always complied with federal law. No, they've never complied with it if they don't like it. And then you either have to fight a war or fight to get compliance. So when you hear all this hyperbole today from the news, especially the 24-hour news sites, telling you, oh, there's a civil war coming. You know, this has never happened in American society before, and I'm thinking, what in the world are you talking about? I guess you're talking to a population that doesn't know any history. And you know what? They're right. People don't know history. And so I'm hopeful that by the end of this, you'll at least learn a few things about history. Next slide. And so what is really interesting about William Still's story really tells us a lot about the stories of other freedom seekers. It tells you about their desperation. It tells you about their resilience. In the story of Henry Brown, most of you have heard about the box, that he got in a box, but you may not know why. You may think, oh, you know, he just decided to do something unusual. In reality, Henry Brown, who was married to a woman, they were owned by different people, had been forced, kowtowed, really, by her slaveholder. His name was Samuel Cottrell. He was a horrible human being. And there were a lot of horrible human beings who were slaveholders. But this man was particularly horrible. In fact, Brown described him as vile and money hungry. Does that sound familiar to you? Okay, I just wondered. Samuel Cottrell knew how much William Still loved his wife and children. So he used that to force William Still to give him $50 every month. $50 every month to take care of his wife and children, or else he would sell them. $50 every month. So somehow Henry Brown was able to raise enough money because he was allowed to hire his own time out. He raised enough money to purchase his wife's freedom. He had talked with the owner, got him to agree to a price. He handed him the money, and he said, when is my wife and children going to get their freedom? And he said, what money? What freedom? So he stole the money from him. Then William Still went back, raised a lot of money, went to an attorney, and this was all in Richmond, and who negotiated the price. He gave the attorney the money, and the attorney stole the money. He was in the process of trying to raise the money a third time when her owner decided to sell her. and the children away. And when she was chained up in a coffle gang, he held her hand and walked with her for 2 miles, not wanting to let her go. And then they drove him away with whips and threatened to beat him to death. And he had to let her hand go. And after she left, he sank into a deep depression and even contemplated suicide. And then he reached out to a friend of his and he said, what can I do? How can I maybe gain my freedom and there I can then find her? And his friend said, go get a box. And so he contacted a carpenter who built a box for him, the exact dimensions of his body. That box would not allow him to move. That's how tight it was. There were no air holes. So he had a little instrument, an arc, where he could bore an air hole in because others had tried and failed. They suffocated in the box. And so what he did, then he had signs painted on the box, this side up, with an arrow pointing up. You know what happened, right? Half the journey, he was upside down. If you can imagine. And I'm not talking 2 or 3 hours here. I'm talking 2 days that it took for him to go from Richmond to Pennsylvania to Philadelphia. He had also contacted through his conductor in Richmond, and actually it was a man in Petersburg named John Hill. He contacted a man up in Philadelphia, a man by the name of McKinn. He was a Quaker, a white Quaker who was an abolitionist who worked with William Still. And that's when, of course, they were going to meet the box when it finally arrived. But they didn't want to open up the box on the docks for 2 reasons. Slave hunters, and they were fearful that he was not alive because they had opened up boxes before and people were dead in them. And so that picture that you see of Henry coming out of the box actually occurred at that office that I first showed you a picture of. Now, William Still was one of the men in this, who opened up the box, but the picture, the drawing that you see of William Still is actually of Frederick Douglass, because the author didn't know what William Still looked like. And so, one black, doesn't matter, so they substituted Frederick Douglass for William Still, but he was there opening up the box. And what that really shows you is how important it was for Henry Brown to gain his freedom and what he was willing to risk. He spent the rest of his life trying to find his wife and children and never succeeded. And so his story tells you about loss and desperation and loss. And that was the story of or I should say that represented what so many others experienced: loss, desperation, and loss. Sometimes the loss was never reconnecting. Other times the loss was not being able to reconnect. Because when enslaved people were sold from each other, when husband and wife was sold from each other, and by the way, the reason that slave marriages were not seen as legal is so that owners could sell them away from each other. So that was a legal tactical move on their part. And a lot of the individuals were harshly told by their owners, stop crying, just go get another spouse. As if it really did not matter that somehow these individuals didn't have love and compassion. And it's not surprising because you had physicians at this time, white physicians, who were writing books, or political theorists who were writing books, like Thomas Dew, who was president of the College of William and Mary in the 1830s, writing books saying that black people don't feel pain the way that white people feel. And today, we still have in the medical sciences people writing textbooks and training physicians to believe that black people respond differently to pain, which is why you still have African Americans who are not getting the kind of help that they need when they go to hospitals or the emergency rooms or doctors, because they're being miseducated about this stuff that all was created to support slavery. It was created to support the idea that black people are so different from white people that they're not, that you don't need to take care of them, you don't need to regard them in the same way, that there's no way that your feelings are translated in their minds to their feelings, that somehow you all are miles apart. And of course, we know those were just justifications. Next slide, please. I want to tell you about a man who was from Norfolk. His name was Isaac Foreman. One thing about a lot of these slave ads and about the way that still would talk about people is they took a lot of time describing exactly what people look like, scars on their face, the different colors. And I don't know, American society has always been fascinated by the different complexions of black people. I mean, hugely. And they would put it in the census records until slavery was over, and then all of a sudden all black people became Negroes. So they just, tried to homogenize, because to be able to identify someone, you had to be clear. You had to really identify what they looked like. That became unimportant after slavery was over. So Isaac Foreman was described as a dark mulatto. Now, I don't have any clue what that might look like. And a mulatto is simply somebody who looked half white and half black. We know, black people know that not all light-skinned black people are half white and half black, that has nothing to do with that. All it has to do with is this repetition of intermingling for sometimes generations with whites or with native peoples. That's what we know. But American society adopted the term mulatto to simply describe a lighter-skinned black person. And they would go with medium mulatto, light mulatto, bright mulatto, dark mulatto, all the spectrum. So I don't have any idea what that looked like. But anyway, if he was from Norfolk, 2/3 of the black people from Norfolk were mixed with whites. 2/3. 2/3. And the only reason I say 2/3 is to just give a little room there. But there was and most of the free blacks in Norfolk had white relatives that they knew about, including some of the founders of Bank Street Baptist Church, First Baptist Church on Butte Street. Do I need to go on? What is now St. John's AME Church, which was the Colored Methodist Church. Do I need to go on? And they supported these individuals. Mary Kelsey Peak, who was a member of First Baptist Church, was light enough to actually pass for white, was related to one of the merchants who was here in Norfolk. And she and her mother were free blacks because of that relationship. And her mother was taken care of and given a home and supported. and eventually left that relationship and married a man from Hampton. And that's how Mary Peak got over to Hampton and met her husband, who also was so light that he could pass for white and did as a spy for the Union government during the Civil War. But he too was related directly to white people in Hampton, and his mother, of course, was related. In fact, if you understand that this was generational, and you have to ask them the question, how is it that people knowingly did this to their own families? Easily. You have parents today who kill their children. So it's that human element, that ability to put money and power ahead of everything else and anyone else. And we see this constantly. Well, going back to Isaac Foreman, he belonged to a woman named Mrs. Sanders. Now, Mrs. Sanders actually lived in Portsmouth, and I don't know what was going on with her. She was a widow. She had 3 slaves who escaped in the 1850s, successfully escaped from her. And weirdly, she hired him out as a steward to work aboard a ship that went from Richmond to Norfolk to Philadelphia. And he met his wife while he was serving aboard the ship, the Augusta. And he also met other people, people who were working on the Underground Railroad, these conductors. And after he married, he just decided, no, I don't think I want to be married anymore, because if I stay married longer, if I don't leave right now, I'm gonna be too much in love with my wife, and we're gonna have children, and I'm just not gonna be able to take it. I'm not gonna be able to survive that. So he decided not to tell his wife he was going to escape. And escape he did. And then he ended up going up to Toronto. And so the picture that you see is of the hotel, the Russell Hotel, which was like the hotel in Toronto. And he worked there as a porter. But he wrote a letter to William Still because he passed through his station, and William Still helped him to get to Toronto, which was one of the largest or most known places that many freedom seekers ended up because they could get jobs there. And once they got jobs and earned enough money, then they would go into the suburbs and buy property, buy a home, and then either start a business or get a job there. But he wrote to William Still shortly after he arrived, and he said, and I quote, "I'm very gloomy in my heart. It's almost breaking over my wife." He said, "My soul is vexed. My troubles are inexpressible. I often feel as if I were willing to die. I must see my wife. In short, if not, I will die. What would I not give no tongue can utter, just to gaze on her sweet lips. One moment, I would be willing to die the next. I am determined to see her sometime or other." Now, not only is that incredibly poetic, but it is also incredibly heartbreaking. And so what I did was I got into the census records, and I tracked him down, and I found out that he not only got his wife Fanny out of Richmond, but their child as well. And eventually they all moved to a place outside of Canada. And that's, next slide, and that's where he lived the rest of his life. Now, I want to show you this picture because this was a typical picture this was the Augusta, the one he worked on, and it was a typical steamship. And those steamships, by the way, if you know anything about Norfolk and you know about Harbor Park, there was an area that was called Higgins Wharf right next to Harbor Park. and it was like between Harbor Park and where the train station is. Higgins Wharf is where all the steamships left. And so that steamship was, and others, the city of Richmond, the Pennsylvania and others, they all left from that dock. Next slide. Well, I looked in the records, and there's a picture of his marker, of his grave marker. And it says where he's from, which is Norfolk. It says when he was born and when he died. And I also highlighted the census record showing him and Fanny living in Canada in a suburb just outside of Toronto. And so they did succeed. And he's an example of one who did not return home after the Civil War. What is interesting about them is they had been members of First Baptist Church here in Norfolk. And so when they left, and well, at least he was a member, when they left and they went to Toronto, they continued to be members of a Baptist church there. So they continued that particular tradition. Next slide. Well, these were compelling stories, and I've talked a little bit about some of the motivations, the harsh treatment, for example, or the separation. There were so many people who were sold. You know, Main Street is where all the slave traders were located in Norfolk. The same thing in Richmond. They located themselves on Main Street. Where was our slave market? Well, that picture shows the slave market in Richmond, but we had our own slave market. It was located 5 feet from where the Confederate monument was located, on Main and Commerce Street. That should tell you a lot, because slavery was big business. In fact, you've heard about how important cotton was. Cotton was king. Do you know that America produced 7/8 of the world's cotton production? 7/8. And of course, all the northern states were somehow involved, because the cotton would go from the south. Some of it would go to England, but a lot of it would go to the north and to the cotton mills, cotton factories in the north, where they would weave the cotton into cloth and then sell them. Do you know that there was one company that actually produced all the uniforms for both the Confederacy and the American government during the Civil War? One company. So that kind of tells you just a horrible tidbit about big business and what it's capable of doing. In Norfolk, if your slaveholder died, that was probably going to be your fate. You were probably going to be auctioned off. And the auctioning occurred at the slave market. All the slave traders were located from where the slave market was up to near City Hall today. And that little circle in front of City Hall was where 2 major slave jails were located. And so it's important that we remember that, because as soon as the Civil War ended, those buildings were torn down. No markers were placed there like with the National Hotel, that people remember the National Hotel. They don't tell you where the slave jails were located. They don't tell you where the slave market was located. They don't tell you where the slave traders were located. We erased that from our landscape so that we could erase that from our minds. But people are living today who are the beneficiaries of being descendants of the slave traders and the slaveholders. In fact, there was a program recently on NBC that talked about how so many people, including our governor, including most of the representatives in Congress, were the descendants of slaveholders, both Republicans and Democrats. And many of them don't talk about it. And only two were willing to talk to NBC. 2. out of over 100. Today, still don't want to talk about it because the myth that slave owners lost everything when slavery ended is a lie. They continued to be prominent, they continued to have money, and they continued to dominate politics. Next slide. So I put a picture, I put a picture up here of the waterways all along the eastern seaboard. And I highlighted the Hampton Roads area so that you see that we are at the mouth of not only the Chesapeake Bay, which is that waterway that goes from all those rivers as they pour into the Chesapeake Bay. We call that the Hampton Roads. It's like a super highway hub. And then from there, 7 miles from there is the opening to the Atlantic Ocean. And when you're crossing the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, I don't know if you've ever looked on one side, and the water is different color than on the other side. One side is the Atlantic Ocean, the other side is the Chesapeake Bay. That tells you also about the depth of the water. And so this shows you how important Hampton Roads is, not only to trade and industry, because that waterway takes you all the way north. And of course, when they built the Intercoastal Highway, that takes you all the way to Maine, so that you are protected from going out into the Atlantic Ocean. So this area was a hub. In fact, North Carolina, eastern North Carolina did not have an access point, which is why these ditches were built in the Dismal Swamp, like the Washington Ditch. It could take you from eastern North Carolina all the way to Norfolk. That was the purpose of it. And so understanding this landscape helps you to see not only how people moved, but how commerce moved. And even more importantly, how people who were treated like commerce, how they moved. And so while there was this movement going to the Lower South, Norfolk was the main departure point for the domestic slave trade in Virginia until the mid-1840s, and then it shifted up to Richmond. But Norfolk continued to be a huge departure point on the domestic slave trade, going to Charleston and going to New Orleans, which had the biggest market out there. It is important to understand when you have that trade going south, yes, you're going to have a lot of people trying to escape because they don't want to go to the south. In their minds, going to the south was a death sentence because these people worked them to death. You didn't have one planting season. You had 2 to 3 planting seasons in the Lower South. You never stopped working. In fact, in the Lower South, they had one day that they gave you off, and that was called Christmas. One day. I remember reading this horrible, horrible textbook that Virginia had. I'm telling you my age now. When I was in the 7th grade, that talked about how slaves basically worked 5 days a week, partied on Saturday, went to church on Sunday, and then did a 9 to 5, basically. Fortunately, I had a teacher who didn't say what I was about to say, which was, this is trash, but they were still, Norfolk did not, Virginia did not remove that book until 1975. 1975. So when our young people talk about, oh, I don't know why we have to keep talking about that slavery stuff, because people have been miseducated about it for generations. And 1975 to now is barely a generation. Barely a generation. So you're talking about people who are my age and older, who were brought up reading this nonsense, who are still alive today, and they are in positions of power. And that's what we have to understand when we look at this history. Next slide. I want you to think about Norfolk. So I show you where Higgins Wharf was located in the lower part of that map. I want to tell you that the Norfolk ferry that had been going back and forth from the early part of the 1800s, continuously until now, that was how a lot of people went back and forth between Norfolk and Portsmouth. And most of the people who worked those ships were enslaved people. So you had black people who were transporting people back and forth. Security issue. And then you had the area of Market Square, which is near where when we talk about Waterside. So if you go to Norfolk, you'll see a marker. And that marker, let me go to the next slide. One more after that. That marker shows you that picture of a man wielding an axe. And the man wielding the axe is James Watson Fountain. In William Still's book, he calls him Captain F. He owned a schooner. He was from Delaware. And he would charge about anywhere from $25 to $50 per person for them to get aboard his ship and hide in a secret compartment. And that ship, that marker, is where that event took place. Where he had 22 people hidden aboard his ship, and he was about to leave. And the mayor of Norfolk and a whole posse of his thugs went on that ship to tear it apart because they heard there were slaves hiding aboard his ship. And he knew he had to think fast, and they grabbed the axe, and they were about to start chopping away at his ship right near the secret compartment. And he grabbed the axe and said, "If you think I have slaves here, I'll help you find them." And of course, he chopped on the other side of the ship where the secret compartment wasn't. So that picture depicts some of them going, "Whoa, there must not be any slaves aboard." But others said, "Go ahead, keep chopping." So they eventually let him go, but they sent word up to Philadelphia to look out for the ship, and he knew that. And so he stopped right outside of Philadelphia, and he had abolitionists waiting to take 22 people off of that ship and to freedom. So we know that people left from this area, and by the time schooners were used, it wasn't just 1 or 2 people. It was 10 or 20 people at a time, and they had children. Next slide. Now, some of you have heard about the events in the Dismal Swamp and how there were many people from the Dismal Swamp who hid out. And I wanted you to see where the Dismal Swamp was located. Of course, if you know anything about the swamp, today the swamp is maybe 1/8 of the size it originally was. In fact, by the time you hit Victory Boulevard, you're on the outskirts of the swamp. The swamp actually went all the way up to where Frederick Boulevard is, if you're on 264. And so a lot of that land has been cleared and reclaimed, but all it needs to do is rain. As you know, water has memory. And, you still get some of that peat moss in there. And the trees all look the same. They all kind of look, scraggly and viney and all that. That's the swamp. That's what the swamp looked like. But because it's a deciduous forest, it's hard to hide in the swamp unless you go to the depths of the swamp. The depths of the swamp was where Lake Drummond is. And Lake Drummond is a very strange place to be. How many of you have ever been to the Dismal Swamp? Ooh, some brave souls. Okay, how many of you have been there in the summer? Ooh, I'm scared of you. I will not go to the swamp past May 15th because I'm a magnet for any mosquito and biting fly out there, so I don't go out there. My family likes me to go out there because I'm the one getting bitten and they're not. But the swamp is filled with all kinds of creatures. But if you are drinking the groundwater, you have an immunity to all of that because you're drinking tannic acid, which doesn't have a taste. It doesn't harm you, but it doesn't allow plants to grow. It doesn't allow fish to grow. But it protects you from chiggers, ticks, fleas, flies, mosquitoes, all of that. And so the swamp is an important place for people because it covers such a wide swath. That's why the swamp was a place where in 1831, Nat Turner was trying to get there, but he decided instead of going to the swamp, he would stay near his family to keep an eye on them. Next slide. This is a picture of close to Lake Drummond. It's almost a circle. Lake Drummond, scientists believe, was created by a meteorite that hit the area. It's only 6 feet deep, but it looks like it's deeper, and there are no fish. And when you go there, you hear nothing. You don't hear flies. You don't hear mosquitoes. You don't hear birds. You hear nothing. That's why they call it the Great Dismal Swamp. It's like you're lost in a vacuum. And if you can imagine, there are people who decided to live there and to raise children there. Next slide. And of course it goes into North Carolina as well. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the Dismal Swamp had been a refuge for a lot of people for a long time. And you can see with the ad, like in the 1760s, you see this ad of people that they believed were hiding in the Dismal Swamp. Next slide. And it was difficult to get back there. You know, there were ways you could get on a little boat and go around. In fact, that picture shows you a little bit of Lake Drummond. You would have, Lake Drummond was not a place, it wasn't it was a lake, so it was completely closed in terms of not having any rivers or streams running into it. But you had other areas that had lots of them. In the Army Corps of Engineers, and even before them, they had people working in the swamp to create these canals, so they drained a lot of the water into these ditches, what they call a ditch. It was large enough to have these small boats transport goods and people back and forth, mostly between Elizabeth City all the way to the Norfolk Portsmouth Harbor. Next slide. And these were the first 2 ditches. So if you go there today, you can see these ditches that were created. They've kind of let them not be that well kept because there's another ditch that's larger, of course, that they've expanded that actually transports people back and forth. It's part of the intercoastal highway. Next slide. But you had some people who would actually hide in the swamp, like Daniel Carr, who's from Portsmouth, who decided he was going to run away. He had been beaten severely, and that was enough for him. And he lived for 3 months in the swamp before he was able to get word to somebody to help him. Next slide. So you had people who actually lived in the swamp while others just stayed in it temporarily. Now, you have to be very desperate to decide to live for any length of time in the swamp. Moses Grandy, who had been enslaved, and he operated a small ship that went back and forth down these ditches going to the Norfolk Harbor, actually talked about his experiences. He had a younger brother who was sent out by his slaveholder to do some task out there in the snow with no shoes and barely enough clothes to wear, and he had to stand out there waiting. the blue boy froze to death, literally froze to death, and the owner let his body stay out there until the birds picked away at his eyes and every part of his body. And he talks about how cruel slavery was and eventually how he was able to purchase his freedom. But he also talked about the Maroons who lived out in the swamp. Next slide. And these are people who ran away and decided they were going to live inside of the swamp. And there were little stores like this drawing that I'm showing you of people who were interacting. Now, this tells you about big business. So the lumber company, because, you know, cedar shingles, cedar wood, that was the big thing in the swamp. Because that's what you built your houses with, especially the roofing. That's what a lot of homes had, sections of cedar, and that kept, of course, insects from coming in. And so there were these little stations where they would recruit workers, they would sit down and get something to eat, drink, whatever, and that's what this picture is. People didn't ask questions, whether you were free or enslaved. They didn't care. A lot of people who were free and enslaved who were sent to work in the swamp, they used that money or the supplies that they got to hire out additional people who were living in the swamp to help them. Those additional people didn't want money. They wanted supplies. They wanted food. They wanted clothing. They wanted tools. And that place was a big place for exchanging a lot of those items. Next slide. There was a man, a reporter by the name of David Hunter Strother, who decided, I'm going to find out if these stories are really true. And he did. He encountered a man, and he drew this picture of Osman, who had he got there sometime in the latter part of the 18th century. He was from Nigeria. He even had the markings on his face, having gone through the initiation ceremony. So he was an adult when he was captured, kidnapped, and brought here as an enslaved person. Remember now, America directly brought in people from West Africa up through 1808. So he was one of those who came during that period. And he was seen as the leader. He was in his 60s, but a big, strong man, frightened Strother to death when he first encountered him. And he saw other people who were part of this group who were living in the swamp generationally. In fact, the children spoke at a whisper. Can you imagine your child not speaking above a whisper? Can you imagine teachers, what a classroom would be with children who were speaking in a whisper? Sometimes that would be good, sometimes not so. But they had to only speak in a whisper because if you're in a swamp, the sound carries. And so they taught them to be protective. Next slide. Well, there was one man, and I actually met him about 25 years ago. He was just starting his research. Archaeologist by the name of Dan Sayers, who was determined to find these maroon communities that he had read existed. And after 25 years, he has found over 30 different maroon communities. And they're on different islands throughout the swamp. He won't tell people where they are. He has them in his records, but he won't tell people where they are because people will go and start treasure hunting for it. Next slide. So we know in these swamps, in these densely forested areas, there are all these islands that were inhabited. And I said 30, I meant 200. Communities of people, and the communities had between 20 and 30 people in each of these little areas. Next slide. And he's found where they lived, the houses that they built, the items that they managed to have. Well, these are the people who would be recruited during the Civil War in 1863 to fight for the Union Army. So there were hundreds of men who came out of the swamp and were recruited to fight for the 36th, 37th, and 38th United States colored troops. And some of those men were actually sent to Galveston, Texas, and to Los Brazos, Texas, in 1865 to free the black people in Texas when the white Texans refused to lay down their arms at the end of the Civil War. Next slide. Well, I want to conclude with this last story because this is an unfolding story. This man, John Atkinson, he wrote a letter to William Still, and he's talking about his experiences. He was from Norfolk, and he went to a church in Norfolk, a church that had a man by the name of Dr. Lundy, who helped him to escape, along with Henry Louis from Portsmouth, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, as well as a whole host of other people. And he wanted his ideas, his letters to be communicated through these people, and they were. Next slide. And so what have we found out? He was talking about what was St. Patrick's Catholic Church, which is now St. Mary's Basilica. He was talking about a man by the name of Dr. Lundy, who worked with a young man named Mark Rene de Morty. De Morty was a Haitian refugee, and he was brought here to this country when he was 10 years old, and he was purchased by a free black woman named Mary Ogilvie. Her father was also a Haitian refugee, and her mother was a free black from Virginia. What is interesting is that she basically purchased him, and he was her son. He arrived at a time when Virginia had passed a law saying if you were recently freed, you had 1 year to get out of the state. If you didn't, you would become a slave again. And so she held on to him as a slave until he was 20, and then she freed him so that he could travel back and forth, which he did, to Boston, Massachusetts. Next slide. Well, he writes, this is De Morty, he writes about how he used to work with Harry Lundy, helping people escape. And William Still actually identified some of the people. But in the 1840s, one of his letters was intercepted. And the letter said, something about him helping people escape. So he had to stay in Boston. Otherwise, he would have been arrested and probably sold as a slave. His erstwhile mother, Mary Ogilvie, would later marry a man from Guadeloupe whose last name was Levesque. Her name is Mary Levesque. And she's the one who got the plans for the CSS Virginia, which was the Merrimack, and got them all the way up to Washington, D.C. to give them in the hands of Gideon Welles, the Secretary of War, and tell him basically that the Confederates were building an ironclad ship. And this helped to speed up the construction of the USS Monitor. That was his mother. Now, he would later on, by the way, become a multimillionaire because he was an inventor as well as entrepreneur up in Boston. Next slide. And so a few years ago, as St. Mary's was uncovering its sanctuary, they found a tunnel that was not on any records that the city had built, a tunnel that was hidden intentionally in the church, a tunnel that also was surrounded by graves, a tunnel that used to bottom out to a wharf. Before they built the downtown tunnel, you had the inlet come in very close to where the church is. The church is at least 12, 15 feet above sea level. So it sat at the top when the wharf was down at the bottom. The church was located in the original free black community, where free blacks for the first time had purchased property. And the tunnel went into the community. And I know that there are people who say, well, there's no proof. I don't agree with that. I believe that this tunnel was a way that people were able to make it to these schooners that were docked at that wharf to leave this area, and that's how Rene de Morty and Henry Lundy were able to get a lot of people out, as well as Henry Louis. They called him Bluebeard because he was such a good conductor on the Underground Railroad that nobody ever caught him. Next slide. And so I want to just let you know that I've tried to detail out some of this history to make it accessible, including some pictures, so that you not only will have an opportunity to read this information for yourself, because there are many other stories that I haven't even begun to talk about here that are in these books, but more importantly, so that you can tell other people and share that information so that one day we can be a community of people who know our history, appreciate the sacrifices, and more importantly, that we never forget these people who lived in the past and did extraordinary things and sacrificed everything for two things: love and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we're going to do is take a brief intermission. Hopefully, first of all, did everybody learn something that they didn't know before? She did a wonderful job. So what we're going to do is take a brief intermission, allow everyone, if you don't know where the restrooms are, Toby over here is going to direct you, and then we also have some refreshments. So let's take about 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, if everyone needs to use the restroom and what have you, and then we'll come back in here and just close up with a brief Q&A. So if you have any questions, please hold them. We will give you all an opportunity to ask, and we'll just have a little bit more conversation, okay? So we'll put a little timer up, and we'll see you back shortly. Hey guys, come help me move stuff, please.
Uncomfortable because nothing will make you change.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. We got mic 5 and mic 2, guys, so you can hear. All right, and then we'll also open up the one on the floor, which I think is 1. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for coming back and joining us. We are going to have a brief Q&A. Hopefully you all have some questions. I have a lot of them. There was a lot that I learned. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start the conversation, and Toby will have a mic. So if anyone would like for Toby, you can just raise your hand, or if you would like to come to the mic right here, we have one set up as well there. So that was a lot. That was a lot, and I know that we barely even scratched the surface on what you could tell us. So first of all, I want to applaud you for knowing as much as you do, being able to hold on to that, because someone like me, I don't know if I have, I don't want to say the patience, but the amount of rage I would probably have as a result. So you being able to not only know that, be familiar with it, be very passionate with it, and share it with us, thank you so much. And again, thank you for even being here with us this morning. I appreciate it. So I was kind of looking and trying to take down notes as we were going through the slides, and so I had always heard things about the Dismal Swamp. So my folks are from Southampton County, so the stories that I was hearing were more based around Southampton County, and knowing that the Tidewater area, Hampton, the birthplace of slavery, and all of this, it barely scratched the surface of the stories that are out there. And I know we all may have heard stories from our parents and our parents' parents about the things that they went through, knowing that a lot of this were one generation removed, 2 generations removed from some of the things that were actually going on. When we were doing our pre-production, so just kind of talking about what we wanted to talk about, you were sharing some stories, and we had talked about Cortland. And I had shared the story. We were talking about Nat Turner and all the things and the atrocity that had happened to him, and how they had taken souvenirs from his body as a result to teach him and everybody else a lesson. And I remember one story you were talking to us about, I believe it was Slavehead Road. Could you share that story with us? Because you and I talked, and the next day I had a meeting here at the church, and I came in and we were having, I don't know if it was an elders meeting or what, but I made everybody sit and listen to the story. Because I think we don't realize, everybody's like, oh, we don't do, that's not here now. It still is. And as a result of this story, which I'll let you tell, that was only 2 years ago that a change had happened. So before, I'll let you go ahead and share that story. Sorry.
So what she's talking about is the Nat Turner Revolt, and how after he surrendered himself, I don't know if you all realize that they did not capture him, and his cave was really right next to his wife's plantation, the one that she was held along with his children as a slave on. And so he wanted to make sure that he was close enough to his family to protect them. And that was the one plantation that had never been attacked, because he wanted to protect his family. And when he believed that his family was in danger, that's when he surrendered. And they needed to make, to make him an example. And so after they hung him, then they dismembered his body. And there are even accounts of them taking his skin and making it into a purse, as if it was leather, melting down the fat on his body to make soap. They treated him like a hog. And so this idea of making him an animal and treating him like an animal was trying to send a message. But what they did to his body was only one of many things. There were a number of black people who followed him, but many more did not. But it didn't matter to the whites. They wanted it's like this rage that happened, because American society had been so fearful of a slave revolt for so many generations. They were talking about that back in the 17th century when slavery began to really emerge. By the 1770s, 1780s, you would see writings talking about this fear. Thomas Jefferson talked about a fear of slave revolts. The reason that George Washington's wife, Martha, freed most of her slaves and then sold the rest away was because she feared after his death, she feared she would be murdered in her bed. And so this idea of, of saying, oh, I'm a kind slaveholder, there was no such thing. If you were holding somebody in bondage, I don't care how you said you were trying to treat them, you were still holding them in bondage, and you knew that. And so a lot of the people who were in Southampton County, and by the way, Southampton County had, right before the Nat Turner Revolt, they had the largest percentage of free blacks than any place else in the country. And historians believe the reason that suddenly Virginia started passing all these anti-free black laws was because free blacks were symbolic of this fear. Even though they weren't involved at all in the revolt, they symbolized the fear that white people had that free blacks could potentially help enslaved people. And so they wanted to get rid of free blacks. And so there was this all-out violence, not only against enslaved people, but especially against free blacks, because with enslaved people, that was somebody else's property. Whereas a free black, you could kill with impunity. You didn't have to worry at all. And there was a law basically that said white people could kill black people with impunity. If you were enslaved and you killed that enslaved person, you had to compensate the owner. But it was not considered a crime to kill a black person because they were not defined as human. And so there were a lot of black people who were killed in Southampton County, both free and enslaved. And to make sure that people were terrified, they chopped their heads off after they killed them and they put them on poles. And it's reminiscent of what what the Romans did to the Greeks when they revolted. And so there was a road where it was hundreds of heads on pikes all along that road. And they used to call that the N-word, Head Road. Then they changed it to Blackhead Post Road because it was a reminder of what the white people did to the black people in that area. And it was symbolic of the violence that occurred, and then they finally just sort of changed the name altogether recently. But that, again, is trying to erase our history. So when I hear about how, America doesn't do these kinds of things, we've never, had assassinations and whatnot, it's like, what are you talking about? When David Walker published his book, Walker's Appeal, in 1829, half the southern states put a bounty on his head, dead or alive, because he published a book. And so when we have these book bannings, it's, to me, reminiscent of how American society is still afraid of truth. And especially when it comes to black people. And I know I'm on my soapbox right now, but my position is we have to stop staying silent. Silence is the same thing as concession. And so, when our governor decided he was going to basically squash the work that we had done on the African American History Education Commission, I was the only person willing to come publicly and say this is wrong, this is a mess. Where are the other black people? Nowhere to be found. it's time we start speaking out for ourselves, because if you don't speak out for yourself, pretty soon you're going to be the only one in the room, and nobody's going to speak for you. So I think that it's time that we gird up our loins and start acting like what we talk about. Where is your shield of faith? Your breastplate of righteousness? Your shoes that have truth on them? Where are these weapons of faith? And it concerns me that we still put money and position ahead of what's really important, which is truth.
Absolutely. So two questions from that. One, and I'll start with faith, and then I'll come back to the money side of it. One of the things, and you talked about how they discovered the tunnel here in St. Mary's. Can we talk about the role of churches in that era? And because the church has always been a center of education, information. And so what was the role of churches, specifically black churches, in that era trying to assist with the slave trade? Because I was fascinated when you were like, you go through the tunnel and it brings you right to the waterways, and we're right here at Waterside. So talk to me a little bit more about the role of churches, faith, and religion in that particular aspect.
Religion has always been a vehicle for dominance, for those who are dominant, and a vehicle for hope for those who are not. And that's why it's not surprising that we have a lot of white nationalism that is articulated through the guise of Christianity. People always wearing a guise to hide what they're really all about. And so historically, our churches have done a lot of that in American society from the beginning. People tell the story of the Puritans and the Pilgrims coming here for religious freedom. They were the first ones who started killing off native peoples. That didn't stop them at all, because once you define somebody as heathen, then you feel the liberty. You're liberated to kill them. And so if you are believing in a religious idea and somehow death to somebody else who differs from you is your go-to response, I don't know who you're worshiping, but it's not the same God I'm worshiping. And so you have a lot of that has historically gone on in our society, and it has its roots back to the beginning. Some of the like Cotton Mather, one of the most known Puritan clergymen, wrote a lot in support of slavery, wrote a lot in support of killing native peoples, wiping them out. And that's the part you don't read about when you read about these individuals. And so I think it is really important that you understand that for African Americans, and those of African descent, first of all, when they began to worship, because a lot of them who first came in, those from Ndongo, from what we call Angola today, many of them had actually been converted to Christianity before they got to this country. And I don't mean some, making somebody say they're a Christian, but they had actually converted. But as with all religions, you don't cast off your culture and your beliefs entirely. You integrate them into how you view your world, how you interpret it. Just like Christianity, it's not pure. It didn't just appear suddenly. This notion of, people used to believe that God could stop or would stop the sun, that the sun wouldn't rise and set on its own. That didn't come from Jewish faith. That didn't come from that tradition. That came from Roman and Greek religious ideas of the god Apollo, causing the sun to rise and set. So, how people have interpreted these different religions comes from where they came from. And so African Americans, or Africans as they would come into this country, began to bring their own belief systems, and it became an amalgamation of ideas with still this notion of God and God creating, and this idea of redemption and resurrection and hope. And so they could not practice those ideas in white churches, because white churches presented God through the lens of whiteness and white dominance. And they made sure that the churches set, where people could sit based on that as well. And so they would go in places away from whites to worship. In the rural areas, they called them hush harbors. But in cities, it would be in these small communities where people were living and gathered. And that's where they were free to practice their religious ideas. And there were churches that we would see slowly emerge in this area that were not integrated churches, where blacks were worshiping together. Initially, for example, over in Portsmouth, you had them worshiping, in the Methodist church there. But then the black communities who were attending wanted to have their own services. They wanted to sing the songs in the way they wanted to sing the songs. And so they actually started meeting separately. They were authorized to meet separately. And they had almost a storefront church on Washington Street until the Nat Turner Revolt. And then they were forced by law to be under the supervision of whites. And so they were then forced to move into the church, and then the white congregation built another church for themselves. And they continued to worship in that church under the covering of a white pastor. And so that's what you would see. But there were white churches in Norfolk, prominent white churches, that had blacks as members. What I thought was really bizarre is they taught the children how to read the Bible. Now, the law said if you were enslaved, and this is back in the 1670s, you were not supposed to teach a slave how to read and write. But the churches actually taught them how to read and write in the city of Norfolk. And that's probably why, and I found this to be totally bizarre, in the 1840s, Norfolk passed an ordinance saying that they were trying to order the postmaster to stop delivering abolitionist newspapers to their enslaved population. Can I say that again? And I had to, it's like, huh? What? Okay, so first of all, the enslaved population knew enough to get a subscription to an abolitionist newspaper, and the postmaster delivered it to these people? I thought that was so bizarre. But that tells you that a lot more people knew how to read and write than what you've heard. And it's because it's an urban environment. But I read you excerpts from letters of people who had just recently found freedom. They wrote these letters, not somebody else. They wrote these letters. So you're talking about literate people, and that was the thing that really terrified slaveholding society, was that you had enslaved people who could read and write. But who would get blamed for it? Free blacks. Not because they actually believed free blacks were involved, but because free blacks represented the ultimate fear that they had: free black people. And since that time, American society has tried very hard to get all the black people out of America, which is why there's still this struggle that American society has of accepting blacks as citizens. And we've already gone through a period in American society in which even the Supreme Court ruled that black people were not citizens. They said, heck, they're not even human. That was called the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision of 1857. Ironically, 100 years before I was born. So I think that there is something poetic about having a big mouth firebrand born 100 years after some crazy decision was written that black people aren't human and therefore could not possibly be citizens of this country. And for those of you who actually were awake and lived through President Obama's election, that's what that mess was all about. Because many people in this country still refuse to accept the idea that blacks could possibly be citizens of this country.
And if anybody has a question, you can make your way. I saw, and there's Toby as well. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and Toby can come, or you can get on the microphone as well. And while they're doing that, we had a brief talk beforehand about the baby boomers and Gen X and what we've taught and how, and the conversation came up in, I'm going to say millennials, but it could be Gen X on down. We've heard enough about the slave stuff. We don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to see the movie. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see Roots. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to, and any of the other narratives that are out there. Whose responsibility is it? Is it theirs, to continue to have this conversation? And there's the adage, you can't, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from kind of situation. So why is it important to still have these discussions?
Our young people have been deprived of understanding that their lives matter and that their ancestors' lives matter. They don't know this history. And the history that they know blames those ancestors for their own enslavement. It lays the blame solely at the feet of the victims for their own victimization. So that's why they don't want to hear about it. I've had one young lady come up and after I was talking about the struggle for voting rights, and she said, I'm so tired of hearing about the struggle and about slavery, and this is a black girl. And I said, well, you're tired of hearing about it because you're hearing about it wrong. That's why you're tired of hearing about it. You're hearing about it as if people are victims. And what you need to understand is they have been victimized, but they're also fighting against that victimization, the victimization that still goes on today. And unless you know this history, you are ignorant not only of your past, but of your present and potential future. The reason you don't want to hear it is because the people telling you this history are not trying to empower you. They're trying to make you feel bad about it so that you participate with them to hide the past, to live the lie, and to act like these things didn't exist. It is critical that you know this history, but not from the perspective of people being victims. Victimization happened, but these people also fought. And so you're not hearing the whole story. It's just like our current governor wants us to talk about black history only from the vantage point of, oh, well, look at this hero over here, and look at this person, what they did over there. But they don't want to put it into context, because if you put it into context, then you really have to tell the whole story. And the whole story ain't pretty, as they say. But it is filled with people who have resilience and who have determination, but sometimes did not succeed. And it is important to know that.
All right, question from the audience.
The thrilled to hear you. I've seen you many times and heard you speak at Norfolk State, and I applaud the way that you present information to so many of us in a way that we receive it not as victims, and I thank you for that. I am very passionate in my pursuit of what next. So my question for you has two parts. What do you envision? Because for me, we're in the same age range, and in my lifetime, I have seen change, a lot of change, but not enough. So I'm asking, what would you like to see? What is your vision of what it would look like to have us where we need to be as a people to really go forth? And the second part of that is, what should each of us be doing going forward?
Thank you so much for your question, for your support. I appreciate that. Knowledge is powerful. That is the one thing you can't buy and sell. It is imperative that we educate. And I'm going to paraphrase Frederick Douglass. Before he died, a reporter asked him, about the state of things, and this was on the cusp of accommodationism. What do you suggest to future generations? And they said, agitate. He said, agitate, agitate, agitate. And my position is educate, educate, educate. We need to take ownership of what once we had. There's a belief, I believe, among too many African Americans that integration was going to be the end of all of our problems. Once we integrated, all of this mess is going to disappear. And I believe people actually believe that. I no longer have responsibility to take my children to museums and libraries and to educate them about blah, 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 blah. That's the school's responsibility. You hand your children over to somebody else to raise, you get what you get. You had those children, not other people. So you have to be engaged with their lives, with what they're learning, and supplement that with additional things. And so there are organizations that African Americans created to do just that. And then people thought with integration, those organizations were no longer necessary. And that I could send my child to a private school that was founded on segregation, and my child would be educated. Yeah, they're going to be educated, but not the way you think. And they're not going to have a good self-concept because there's nobody telling them that they should be valued. And of course, they then are surrounded by individuals who do not look like them. And then they adopt all of those values from individuals who grew up in a society that does not value your child. How in the world can that child then be proud of who they are and want to know their history when they're told by their friends, well, slavery, the slaves, oh, that's funny. And you're seeing so much of that mess coming out because that's what those individuals have learned. They're not educated broadly. So I think we need to not only understand that we need to educate our children and provide opportunities and make sure, children are children. I have some cousins who actually debate with their 10-year-old about what they should do. And I ask them, why are you debating with your child? This isn't a debate. You go to bed now. Put that iPad down and pick up that book. We're not having a discussion. And when I see the child, that child knows. Cousin, this cousin? Yes. What did I just tell you? Okay. Because when I ask you to do something, the next time I say something, it's not a request. End of story. It doesn't need to be any violence. There just needs to be determination and a declaration. End of story. And so children don't learn because they're excited to learn. They learn because someone introduces them to something, whether or not they want that introduction or not. And then they find out they are actually interested in it. But they're children. We have to understand what children are. They're not young adults. They're children, and they have to be introduced. And we need to start introducing them and being proud of our own culture. And I don't mean the culture of stereotypes. I don't mean the nonsensical culture that you see being perpetrated by Hollywood and others to lampoon who we are and to make us a butt of jokes. I mean the real culture, not that manufactured crap that you see on reality TV and other places. And unfortunately, too much of that drives us, not the other way around. And so it's time that we start stepping up. For those of you who are retired, you've got time to give back. And I think churches can be a space for tutoring programs. It can be a space to have history camps every summer. You know, you have everybody running for football, basketball, and even STEM camps. But what about literary camps? What about history camps? Without those two things, you're not exposing your child to knowledge, to real knowledge, not only about themselves, but about their world. And I think if we go back to that, stop focusing so much on making money. Focus on making adults that are fully realized, adults that are educated, who know who they are, because a person who knows who they are a very dangerous person. You can't flim-flam them. You can't mess with them. And I'm reminded of what Mark Twain said. There are two important dates in your life: the day you were born and the day you find out why you were born. And I think it's incumbent upon us to help our children to find out why they were born. But they can't find out why if they're languishing in ignorance. So I hope I answered your question.
That was absolutely. One of the things, I went to a private school when I was younger, and it just so happened we were going to Jamestown, the Jamestown settlement. We were going to do Yorktown, and my mother took a while to sign the permission slip. And it just so happened I got sick, so I couldn't go. And I was just so upset that I was going to miss this field trip with all of my classmates, and my mother said, I'm going to take you and show you Jamestown, because anything that you could learn on that trip, I can teach you better. And she did, and she loaded all of us in the car, and she and my father took us up, and the experience was amazing. And we did the guided tour, but then we also had commentary from things she had witnessed, that my grandparents had witnessed, and it was a completely different experience. So being able to educate and pass that down is absolutely amazing, because we also have to remember who the books were created by, the narratives that were created, and which version you are going to get. I'm not saying that is not a diluted version. It could absolutely have some, but there are also other stories. And we also have to remind, there are a lot of people in this room that went through integration. you know, from segregation to integration. My parents, you know, going to an integrated high school and how much that impacted them, you know, even though they were in high school at that time, just the differences. And so we're not as removed from this as some would like us to believe. So I think that's important. And I actually had a question, and then we're going to get your question, Deacon Williams. But the question was, how do we not be upset? We've heard this. We know that change, we know we need to remember. But what do we do to make sure that we're just not responding in a rage or angry? Or are we allowed to feel that? You know, how should we be feeling?
You know, you should be angry sometimes. When I get really angry about something, I just put the book aside or put the document down for a while, let that process. If you didn't get angry, you wouldn't be human, or you wouldn't be a compassionate person. So anger is a reaction. Now, what you do with that anger, that's the issue. So you can filter that anger to making sure that people know that story, making sure that others have heard that story and have a conversation and create, you know, how can we make sure this doesn't happen in the future? So you create an action movement. You know, I know, for example, that Evelyn Butts got angry about the poll tax. And without that anger, she would not have been brave enough to have been that test case. Because trust me, she got lots and lots and lots of death threats. And so, you know, anger sometimes can be a good thing. But what you do with it can be a powerful thing for good.
Excellent.
I want to thank you for what you are doing, and to thank both of you for the platform. Thank you, Pastor, for doing this. It is appreciated. I learned something in particular about the tunnel going underneath the Catholic Church, and I appreciate everything that you are imparting to us, and I wish more were here to hear it. I just wanted to make a couple of statements. I have an acquaintance who is a descendant of Nat Turner by the name of Ulysses Turner, who told me close to 20 years ago that after Nat Turner's rebellion, that in the course of dismembering him, like you said, like that they had taken his skin and turned it into lampshades, and that those lampshades still exist in Southampton County today. And I just wanted to mention that. But the one question I wanted to ask you is, when you were mentioning the original dimensions of the Dismal Swamp and where it originally extended to, it sounds like, coming up from Deep Creek, that it extended well into what we know as Camelot and Cavalier Manor and all of that area, and it ended up being drained and cleared away and turned into land that could be used for housing. And I just had no idea that that place was that big. Mm-hmm. I knew about it going into North Carolina, but I did not know about it extending into Portsmouth and Chesapeake in that direction like that. But all in all, I guess it's not really a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing, and keep sounding the alarm as long as you are able to do it. I engage in discussions with my wife and my two sons pretty frequently during the week about what is going on today and how history seems to be repeating itself. And I'm going to make noise because I got a little bit of intelligence about myself, and I've never been in trouble with the law, and I vote. And that makes me dangerous to some people. And I'm actually proud of that. And I'm going to keep making noise, and I'm hoping that others will join me in making noise as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Only thing I have to say is amen.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, a quick question.
Okay, come to the mic for me.
I always heard the Dismal Swamp went
Yeah.
all the way
Come to the mic.
Mississippi. that true, or do I just need
No,
to
it didn't
check my
extend.
geography?
It didn't extend that far. That would be incredible.
Yeah.
Actually, you've had series of swamps throughout. Just like Virginia Beach, there's a swamp that's there, and that's not the Dismal Swamp. It's separate from the Dismal. So down in Mississippi, you have that whole swampy area anyway. It's not part of the Everglades, but it is part of that, what is naturally a low-lying area. You're going to have a swampy location there. And so, wherever you have a lot of waterways, as in our area, and the further south you go, in Carolinas and so forth, you're going to find that you will have lots of swamps.
Okay.
And what helps to really identify swamp is peat moss. And because you're talking about water that's overrun the landscape for a very long period of time, and that's sort of a natural evolution of how these plants evolve and begin to, survive. They, because peat moss can go down up to 6 feet below the surface, and you step on peat moss, you're going to go down into the water. And then, because what it does is it hides where the real land is located, and the land has been overrun to some degree by the water. So the peat moss kind of doesn't allow you to see the difference between the land and the waterways.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up a good majority of the day, because you can see we can sit here and talk, because I have so many other thoughts, but I'll hold them till afterwards. But again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, for answering our questions, for telling us a bit more about this area, the waterways, the slave trade here in Virginia. And I'm sure, again, you only scratched the surface. So we'll have to have you come back.
I'll be happy to do
I would
so.
love
Thank
that.
you.
Please. Thank you so much. All right, so Toby, you want to come on up? You got your mic, or you can use mine.
Well, Dr. Newby Alexander, thank you so very much for making time to be here with us today. This is a conversation that personally I think needs to continue. Clearly there's so many more aspects of this conversation that we could continue to talk about. And this is just a small token of appreciation from Second Calvary Baptist Church and the Innovation Technology Ministry. So we thank you so very much. And I do want to say quickly, as we were entering today, there are several brochures that were at the entrance, a brochure that Dr. Newby Alexander wrote on Waterways to Freedom. The brochure about Chesapeake's African American Heritage Trail, that was actually my first opportunity to meet Dr. Newby Alexander. So she is the podcast host, part of that trail program. It's a self-guided driving tour through Chesapeake, but then there are about 6 or 7 different podcasts, different topics, and she is the host for the topic on the Dismal Swamp. And there's a superintendent's house out that way. So I just wanted to be sure that you knew that when you have an opportunity to take those brochures, you can continue to learn even more about some of that particular story. So thank you. And we will, I guess we'll exit the stage, and then we'll have Pastor Guns. If you would, please come forward for final remarks.
And we also put the books, if you all want to learn more about the books, let us know. We can definitely send the slide out and post it. Thank you, Kenya. All right, and Pastor's on the floor, so you got to switch your one.
Okay, thank you. To Dr. Newby Alexander, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you, all of you, for coming. The presentation is on our Facebook page. It's on our website, it's on our mobile app, so you can share it with your family and friends. History is very important. I love talking about history. Thank you. I did get an idea from you. today, a summer history camp, the opportunity to bring kids together to talk about history, to talk about our history, to talk about American history, and to talk about the history of this area. I think I asked the question about Norfolk in 1879 because that's the year that the church was founded, and to have some really historical understanding about the area and about the people, the context, would really be helpful for us to really kind of understand our story and the people who actually founded the church. And I don't know if we have ever had any written documents from that generation, or if there are documents that can be found that would really trace back to the time of 1879 when the congregation was actually founded. So thank you so much for coming. And we do have another gift that we want to give you. We'll put it in the mail to you, or I will come and bring it to your office myself. Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. Have a great day. And we hope to see you tomorrow for our Taste of the Nations. It's our Heritage Sunday. And, they've been doing some work over in the fellowship hall to make sure everything is all set up. Thank you, Elder Pope, and to the Ministry of Innovation and Technology. You can get her books. I have ordered them. I do have both copies. And I do have a copy of William Steele's book as well. So it's really great reading, interesting, and very insightful. Have a great day. God bless you.
Thanks, everyone.